Can't stop everywhere.
Yeah.
No.
They're
lucky that they're not being tunnels.
You need to join me here.
Although they still have a sort of tar around, sort of four stations through the tail as well.
Yeah.
And they only really need one.
Yeah. Well, you trouble is, most people have really.
Okay, so it's going to sound good.
No. Well, we've only got one station. And we'll be about 5 station, so you either walk, catch a bus, or take a car. Yeah, it's all inside. We don't have the lunch.
Okay. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Sorry for the obligatory IT faff we just had, but there we go. We started now. So welcome to our April lunchtime seminar. They happen the first Tuesday every month. And they are one of our most popular events. They normally last about an hour, but we're already a little bit late already. So we've got 3 venues today: Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, and some people who are dialing in on the webinar. Just to let you know what's going on here, the webinar is run from this laptop in front of me. So the speaker has to be sort of trapped behind the lectern here so we can understand what's going on. But first, I'd like to recognise our sponsors and supporters, premier partners such as JLT and SAI Global, our lunchtime seminar sponsors, Cybercraft and Safety Associates, and our lunchtime seminar supporters at our venues across the cities who have called in. And that's KPMG here in Wellington, Navigatus in Parnell and Auckland, and Christchurch City Council and Powerco. So before we start though, just a couple of rules about questions. As the seminar goes on, if you're remote from Wellington, please feel free to type questions into the webinar as we go, and we'll use those questions at the end. And at the end, we'll have a Q&A session where we'll open up to remote venues on webinar, and then also after that to Auckland, then Christchurch, and then back here to Wellington. So today we have Tony Yule, who's kindly come to speak with us. Tony is a certified life coach, a clinical therapist, and the author of 7 Ways to Reduce Anxiety in 7 Minutes or Less. I think we built up a bit of anxiety in the last 15 minutes trying to get this thing running. He is a coach and an instructor with Your Life Live It, an international coaching and training company. Tony is passionate about helping people develop their life skills they need to minimize stress and anxiety in their lives. Tony is based in Wellington and works with national and global clients. He served on RiskNZ board for 7 years and was the organisation's treasurer for 11 years, and he is a life member of our organisation. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Tony, who'll be presenting on managing the risks posed by stress employees.
Hello, everyone. I just make sure everybody can hear me. So I'll be announcing when to turn over the slides as we go along. Okay. So I have experienced work-related stress myself during my accounting and risk management career on numerous occasions, but it was one particular occasion about a decade ago that sent me into a black hole. And I spent about 2 months in that black hole, and it wasn't a very nice place to be. And when I eventually came out of that black hole, I promised myself that I'd never go there again, and that I would find out all that I could about stress and anxiety. So I set off on that journey, and along the way I decided to change careers. So I decided, rather than be a stress management expert, I would become a life coach and help people to stress less, overcome anxiety and lift depression. And so that's what I do now. Looking back to when I did manage or was responsible for the organisational, operational risk and strategic registers way back when, employee stress risk wasn't really on the radar. It really was thought of being an HR issue, and something that if somebody approached management saying they were stressed, they'd be dealt with on an individual basis. So I was interested to see how things have changed in the 10 years since I last wore my risk management hat. And what I discovered was that the number of stressed people in the world is increasing alarmingly. In fact, the World Health Organization calls stress the 21st century health epidemic, and that estimates that by the year 2020, stress-related disease and illness will be the #1 cause of death in the world. So that's nice to know. And around the world, research tells us that organizations are experiencing a huge increase in the number of stressed employees within the organization. Research also tells us that 1 in 6 people at any point in time, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people are experiencing stress. And this global increase in the number of stressed employees is reflected in New Zealand. In 2017, the Southern Cross and New Zealand Business Wellbeing in the Workplace study found that for the previous 4 years, the number of stressed employees had increased year on year, and the trend was upwards. So we have an issue. Another study from the Ministry of Health, which appeared in a Dominion at the weekend, was about the number of young stressed New Zealanders there are. And in this Ministry of Health survey in 2017, they found that 79,000 young New Zealanders between the ages of 14 and 24 were experiencing stress. And research tells us that if you experience stress and anxiety at a young age, you're more likely to experience it as you get older, as you become an adult. And I guess for employers, we need to consider that, because these 79,000, and it's probably more now because that survey was done a couple of years ago, are our future employees. So, over to the next slide. So what is the risk that organizations are facing? Well, this is how I define it. It's that the behavior of 1 or more stressed employees will have a negative impact on the achievement of 1 or more of the organization's objectives. And it's really about behavior, because we know from the research, and we've known this since about 1950, that as a person's stress level rises, their performance and productivity goes down. So it's really about what's the impact on a person's behavior of their stress level. One of the organization's objectives is to comply with legislation, and I made a mistake here on this slide. It should really say the Health and Safety in the Work Act of 2015. And what that act says is that employees must, as far as they can reasonably protect the physical and mental health of employees. And so now there's this obligation on employers to manage the mental health, which is assumed to mean work-related stress of their employees. So we have a sort of legal risk and also this operational risk. We head to the next slide. So consequences. So what is the impact on the organization of having a workplace full of stressed employees? What's their behavior going to have an impact on us? Well, I've listed them here. There's financial and non-financial impact. The UK Stress Management Society uses this bridge analogy to sort of explain the impact, in that as your number of stressed employees rises in the organization, so does the impact on your financial and non-financial objectives, until you get to the point where the strain's too much and the bridge collapses. So we can pretty much summarize the consequences as saying, the impact of the behavior is that our productivity and performance is going to drop, our costs are going to go up. It's estimated, as it shows there on the slide, that the cost of work-related stress absence in New Zealand in 2016 was 1.5 billion. The research tells us that presentism, which is where people come to work when they're stressed and anxious and ill in other ways, is about 1.5 times the level of absenteeism. So we've got a rather large financial cost. Other research out of the UK tells us that in terms of managing stressed employees, the cost is around 2,500 New Zealand dollars per employee. Got some significant consequences. If we skip to slide 4, let's have a look at likelihood. Well, the likelihood is certain, because I've already said that at any point in time, 1 in 5 or 6 of us is experiencing stress. And so, we can reasonably say that 20% of our workforce at any one point in time is experiencing some level of stress. Another study carried out in the UK by risk advisory firm Willis. Found that in a global survey that they did, that 47% of the people in the workplaces said that their stress level was above average or high. So we can sort of say, well, okay, between 20 and 50% of our employees at any one time are experiencing some level of stress. So if we head over to the next slide, so before we go on to look at how we assess and treat this risk, just put in a bit of context, I guess, around what is stress and what causes it. And so all of us have inside of us an internal risk management system, and it's been around for about 600 million years. It's very effective. It's protected our ancestors and ourselves from harm and death. And we could call that internal risk management system our stress process. And the stress process has 6 steps, and they fortunately spell the word stress. So I'll quickly run through that. It's important that we understand how we do stress and what stress is. So we have some information come in from the environment around us, stimulus, goes inside us, goes to an area of our brain called the amygdala, which does a threat detection exercise first off. So our amygdala's got a record of all the threats that we've faced in the past. And it seeks to match the incoming information against those threats. And if it matches one, then we feel fear, which is the emotional arousal, sends a signal to our body to trigger the stress response, which is commonly known as the fight or flight response. So that prepares our body to fight or flee. And the cocktail of symptoms, physical sensations, and thoughts and feelings that we have as a result of that activation of the stress response is what we commonly call stress. So stress is something we experience. Now, if our amygdala doesn't detect the threat, then the information shortly afterwards arrives at our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain, which has time to interpret the information and do a bit of a risk appraisal. And so all the information that comes in has no meaning until we give it a meaning. So this is important that we know that our bully boss or our workload isn't the thing that's causing us stress. It's only when we perceive it to be a threat does it cause stress. And that's why, the person next to you at work might look cool and relaxed when they're doing the same job as you are, and you're stressed to the max, because we all have our own perceptions of things. So our prefrontal cortex determines whether or not this is a threat or an opportunity or something that's routine. If it decides that it's a threat, it says, how big is the threat? And do I have enough resources to cope? And if the answer is no, I can't cope, then it sends a message to your amygdala, and the amygdala signals the alarm, and we experience stress. If we turn to the next slide, slide 6. So what is it that, that our brain is assessing or praising as a threat to? And at a macro level, it's whether there's a threat to our physical or emotional needs. So we all have physical needs, the need for movement, the need for sleep, the need for nutrition, etc. And we also have a set of emotional needs. And there are various models of emotional needs, and the one I use has 9 emotional needs. This is developed by the Human Givens Institute in the UK. And what the model says is that 24/7, 365 days a year, our brain is trying to ensure that we satisfy these needs, that we meet our need for security, achievement, etc. And if we don't, then we're going to experience that as a threat, and we're going to experience stress. So this is relevant from a employee stress risk perspective, because people spend 1/3 of their lives at work. And so for a lot of people, work is the main source of where they meet these needs. So if the work environment's not meeting these needs, then they're going to feel stressed. Yeah. We move on to the next slide. So we're in a place now where we can put a definition to work-related stress. So the Health and Safety at Work Act doesn't define work-related stress, but this is how I define it. It's the stress we experience in response to a perceived threat in the work environment to one or more of our physical and emotional needs. Skip over to the next slide. So when it comes to assessing the risk, I think there's three things that we need to identify. First of all, we need to identify the common work-related stresses. We need to identify those employees who are at risk of becoming stressed and those employees who are currently stressed. And I'll talk about each of those in a bit more detail in a moment. This is a point of reference. Massey University are currently doing a study called the New Zealand Workplace Barometer, where they're looking at how the work environment impacts on stress-related illness. And organisations that have got 50+ employees can participate in that study. And at the end of it, you'll get a report about your sort of psychosocial well-being of your organisation, and you'll get some performance indicators, etc. So it might be something that organisations are interested in. So flicking over to number 9, identifying common stresses. So whilst each of us perceives the world uniquely, and so as I said earlier, person A might feel that his workload is stressing him out, and person B who's got the same workload doesn't. What we know from the research is that there are certain things, certain life events that the majority of us perceive to be threats. And so we can call these common stresses. So it's really important within the organisation that we identify these, because if we can address these and remove them from the workplace or reduce their impact, we're going to have a sort of wide-scale impact, positive impact on the amount of stress that our employees are experiencing. And so the ways of doing that is to rely on the information that you're already gathering. So organisations should already be gathering sickness, absence data, productivity data, staff turnover rates, etc. And by looking at that information and seeing what it's telling us, we can not only identify where the common stresses are in the organisation, but what they are. Another way of identifying common stresses, of course, is to survey our employees and ask them, what within the work environment is causing them to experience stress. Another way is to look outside of the organisation and to look at the research that's gone on around the world, which has pretty much identified the sort of top stresses amongst most organisations. We go to the next slide. These are the 7 most commonly identified work-related stresses, and in no particular order, albeit that that Wellness in the Workplace survey that I mentioned earlier, done by Southern Cross and New Zealand Business, the number 1 stressor that they identified in 2017 was excessive pressure and high workload. Moving on to number 11, identifying at-risk employees. So how do we do this? Well, I think once you've identified the common stresses in the organisation, or you use that list of 7 common stresses, then what you can do is you can look and say, okay, well, who's going to be impacted by any of those in the future? And if so, then they fall under the umbrella of at-risk employees. So if you're planning to do some organisational change at some point in the near future, then the people who are going to be impacted by that organisational change are going to fall under this umbrella of at-risk employees. You can also rely on your managers and supervisors who hopefully are having conversations with their staff and have a feel for how their staff are feeling and whether or not, there's stuff going on outside of work that's impacting on them, and whether, if they give them some more work, it's going to tip them over the edge into the stress zone. look at the next slide, identifying a stressed employee. Ideally, stressed employees would come forward and announce themselves and say, look, I'm feeling stressed. Can you help me? However, research by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the UK, when they did a study, found that only 57% of people were prepared to do that. The other 43% said that they never tell their employer that they were stressed, or their manager that they were stressed, because of the stigma connected to that and the fear that they would be judged. So we can't just rely on people putting their hand up and saying, I'm stressed. But again, what we can do is rely on our managers and supervisors who are at the coalface, really. And by training them to identify the signs of when people are experiencing stress, hopefully we'll be able to identify stressed employees. We can also use the metrics in the organization in terms of looking at, whether there's sudden spikes in absence for a certain person, or whether a particular group's productivity has fallen. These are areas to explore in terms of identifying stressed employees. So moving on to slide 13 and risk treatment. What we need in order to address this employee stress risk is a comprehensive organization-wide approach. And the most popular approach that's used in Europe is based on a British standard called PAS 1010 2011, Guidance on the Management of Psychosocial Risk in the Workplace. And that particular document recommends a 3-level intervention. And the Stress Management Society in the UK have quite kindly drawn this diagram, which illustrates those 3 levels of intervention. So there's a primary level of intervention, which is at the organizational level, and that's proactive. We're doing things proactively there. There's a secondary level, which is focusing on individuals, and that again is proactive. And then we have our tertiary level, which again is focusing on individuals, but is reactive. You can see from this slide, level of effectiveness versus the cost of each of those interventions. And so if we do things at an organizational wide level that impact on the most employees, then it's most effective and least cost. Whereas if we're working with individuals who are already stressed, then it's least effective and there's more cost. If we go to the next slide. The primary level interventions, as I said, proactive, they're at an organizational wide level. And really the focus is on removing or reducing those common stresses that we looked at earlier from the workplace, because that gives us our biggest bang for the buck. We're also looking here at doing things like changing the workplace culture. So we're introducing a well-being culture where management leadership is committing to putting resources and emphasis on reducing the risk to mental health for their employees. So we could see things under this umbrella, such as a wellness policy that would perhaps incorporate a piece on stress management. We would see, in terms of organizational change, in terms of addressing some of those stresses, changing work schedules, changing job descriptions, implementing support services, etc. So things that impact across the organization. Before we look at secondary, next slide, before we look at secondary interventions, I need to mention non-work related stress. So we have one stress level, yeah, and our stress level is topped up by work-related stresses and non-work related stresses. And so the things outside of work, the stresses, add to our stress level. So when we go into work and we're highly stressed and our behaviors and our performance is suffering, then perhaps we have to take work home, because we think, oh, well, I've got to catch up now. We take work home. But by taking work home, then you're not meeting your needs at home because now you're not spending as much time with your kids or your wife or your friends, or you're not doing the things you like. So your brain says, oh, well, we're not meeting our needs now, so we're under threat. So now you've got some threat being created, stress being created outside of work, which tops your stress level up. So then when you're going to work the next day, you've got a higher stress level. So your performance is even more degraded. So then you think, oh, I've got to really work harder, maybe stay at work longer, take more work home, which then impacts on how you satisfy your non-work needs. And so you're in this vicious cycle. And research by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the UK found that 60% of a person's stress level is related to non-work related stresses. So I think for organizations, that's important to know, because whilst an employer is only responsible for reducing the amount of work-related stress, you know, a stressed employee is a stressed employee. And so it really will benefit an employer if they can help that employee to manage their overall stress level, as opposed to just focusing on, well, how can we reduce work-related stresses? And so if we go to the next slide, that's really the intention of these secondary level interventions. It's to focus on the individual and give the individual the training and education so that they can manage the stress themselves. So it's about teaching about that risk stress process that we looked at earlier. It's about teaching them how they can intervene into that process at certain stages so that they can avoid stress, or else they can reduce it. It's also about providing them with more resources, you know, because when we do that threat analysis, I've got a threat, do I have the resources to cope? And often they'll say no. If we give our employees some more resources in the terms of, say, some time management skills, some conflict management skills, some assertiveness skills, those kind of things, then they're less likely to experience as many threats. A key portion of our employees that we want to focus on in this secondary level intervention is our managers and supervisors, because they are at the coalface. They're the ones that are working with people, and they're the ones that we want to identify those stressed employees, and also to be able to support those stressed employees. So we want to be able to educate those people on how to have those difficult conversations with stressed employees around stress. If we go to the next slide, tertiary level interventions. So this is pretty much the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff kind of stuff. So this is helping people who are already stressed. So, you know, the reality is that whatever we do, there's still going to be people who are stressed. And so how do we support those people? And so this level, we're looking at, you know, providing counseling, therapy, coaching, return to work initiatives, rehabilitation initiatives, and working with individuals on a one-on-one basis. Next slide. So once we've got our risk management system in place and it's been operating for a while, we just need to, like with any system, evaluate how effective it is, what's the return on investment. And the research tells us that for every dollar spent on well-being initiatives, the return is $4.20. So it's quite a good return on investment. So if we've established some benchmarks beforehand, like what were our productivity levels before, what was our absenteeism levels before, etc., then we can go back and have a look at those after we've intervened and see if productivity is up, absenteeism is down, if the results from our well-being in the workplace surveys are showing a much better workplace environment, culture, sense of well-being. And it's a case of continual improvement. So we want to be, you know, looking at where we can improve on things and enhance the system. And so this slide sort of summarizes what I've said. But I would say that what we have here, I think, is an operational risk in that, you know, the level of stressed employees in an organization is pretty significant now. The consequences on an organization is pretty significant in terms of lost productivity and cost. So in my opinion, I would see it as a moderate risk operational risk at least, potentially higher for other organisations. It is manageable if you put in place an effective employee stress risk management strategy, and that three-level intervention model seems to work very well in the UK. And if we flip it on its head, I guess the benefits of doing this kind of thing is that we get increased productivity. We get increased engagement from the workforce. We get reduced costs. And we meet our legal obligations to minimize the impact of risks on the mental health of our employees. And that. Next slide was questions. That was that.
Right, thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much. Well, what we'll do now is go through questions, and we'll start off by opening the questions up to the regions, remote areas. So if you are on the webinar and you have your mic muted and you are on a remote viewing with the webinar, be prepared to ask a question. But we have two typed in. Should we do this first?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, do you want to manage those, Emily, and then Tony can go from there.
Why does stress while young increase chances when older? Does one not learn to cope with stress, provided not too much, by being under stress while younger? Well, I guess, yes, some people do become more resilient as a result of the experiences they've had as they're younger. But I guess the majority of people don't. We're not taught, I guess, how to manage stress in schools or anything. And so we're pretty much left to our own devices. And the thing with stress is that the more often your stress response gets triggered, the more hyperactive it becomes, basically. And so that's why, your chances of, I guess, responding to things in the future and experiencing stress as an adult increases. I hope I answered that one. The next question is, you seem to be defining risk as the chance of an employee being stressed. However, is there a second level, the level of impact on the organisation? For example, those in safety critical roles. Well, what I was defining risk as the impact of the behaviour of stressed employees on the organisation. There is, of course, the risk for the employee themselves of being stressed. But I guess what I wanted to highlight here was that it's not just a HR risk. I believe that this is an operational risk that perhaps isn't, say, being taken too seriously, in that the cumulative impact of that behaviour of those stressed employees on an organisation, I believe, is significant. Yeah. So we've got to, and I think by engaging in those secondary level interventions and by teaching employees how to manage their own stress, then we're addressing that second level that you talk about. So if we can teach, as you've got here in your question, example pilots, if you can teach pilots how to manage stress more effectively, then that's going to mean they're going to perform better when they're in those situations when they might otherwise suffer from brain fog or panic. No questions from Christchurch.
New Plymouth, are there any questions from you? Yeah, can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah, we just wanted the summary slide back up. And were these slides going to be available for distribution post this webinar?
Yeah, I should have mentioned at the start, actually, underneath each of the slides is some pretty comprehensive notes that I've made. So I forgot to mention that, there's no need to take notes really. So they will be available.
Any questions?
No, cool. Thanks very much for that. And cheers, Tony, for your insight on the stress workshop, I guess.
Auckland, any other questions?
No more questions aside from those two we typed. Thanks so much, Tony. Very interesting.
Thanks, Jim. I think that's it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Tony, and thank you, Emily, for arranging that. So for you who are not with us in the room, I'm now giving Tony a small gift. Oh, thank you for coming along. Here's a little black box for you. I think there's something inside it, which is excellent. So look, that was a really great presentation because, as we all know, it affects all of us and everyone around us, and we just don't talk about it enough in our workplace and at home. So it's great to just pause and dip into this thing which affects everybody. So thank you very much for coming, Tony, and we'll share those slides, which is wonderful. So this wraps up our lunchtime seminar. Oh, quick questions in this room here. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Everyone started twitching when I spoke. Yes, first question.
New Zealand business really, for a good bit of the time, hasn't really looked at taking much interest in its employees at all. They just treat it as something that you can kick around.
Is that a question or just a comment?
That's a comment.
Change processes that every organisation undertake. They completely underestimate without stress those change processes for employers.
Right.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, you would expect you lose a year if you have a reorganisation, basically. Again, I'm interested in the outdoors, and that's what my experience has been with the Department of Conservation, that they just go to bits, they have new people and new faces that don't know very much, etc., and it costs them about a year.
Yeah, I mean, I saw, well, the comment here was that, if you have stressed employees and they leave the organisation, it sort of costs, it takes about a year or so to get back the productivity, I guess, is what we're saying. And the research tells us that, when for a chief executive, it's on average 9 months for them to be 100% productive. So not only have you got the costs of employing and finding a new chief executive if he or she's stressed or burnt out, you've also got to wait 9 months for that person to become effective. For other members of staff, it's anywhere between 3 and 9 months. So there is that cost as well.
So what do you suggest in terms of things, common things that could effectively manage help organizations in a way that you can manage the stress side of people?
Well, I think organizations need to acknowledge that, they are going to be creating stress in people, you know, that those 7 stresses, you know, one of them was change. You know, change for the majority of people is going to result in stress. And I know when I was working a decade ago, you know, in the organisation I was in, we seemed to go through, you know, change every 5 minutes, but nobody ever once offered any help with managing the stress. If you're unfortunate to lose your job, then you got, you know, help with, you know, doing your CV and so forth. But nobody ever, you know, gave you any help in terms of alleviating the anxiety and the stress. Things have changed now, of course. You know, we've got well-being programs, we've got EAP programs, etc. But I think it is being aware and being proactive that, you know, change does create stress in people, and putting in place some initiatives beforehand to manage that, not just do the change and then wait to see who falls out the other end, who's stressed and anxious, etc. Particularly as we've seen from that slide, you know, that 43% of people aren't going to put their hands up anyway, you know. So you just want to be the worst cases, really. So yeah, it's about being more proactive, I think, and adopting that well-being culture, you know. And I guess, you know, it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? You know, but employees are, you know, our number one asset, and perhaps we've forgotten that. And our drive for, you know, lower costs and more profit, etc. Yeah.
Think of it as a stigma, but I'm also wondering if there's a proportion who kind of think of all the whistleblower, what are the impacts to me, or what's the backlash in that kind of thing. So, and also along with that, I didn't see anything around exit interviews, which are the formal constructs where these things can be raised. But again, I don't think people are bold enough or have been bold enough and courageous to kind of raise these issues.
That's right. Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering if there's a bigger leadership kind of aspect here, which is being ignored and which kind of can be, you know, to change the culture around this issue.
I feel sort of positive in that, you know, over recent years we've seen a move to more of this sort of well-being, and, you know, we've got the government's emphasis at the moment on, you know, on well-being, and we're going to have a well-being budget, and, you know, one of the strategies in there is on mental health. We've got more organisations putting in place well-being initiatives, albeit, you know, they're sort of targeted around that sort of tertiary level, I guess, as opposed to being more proactive. We're heading in the right direction. It's just, yeah, we've got to do more around creating a well-being culture and destigmatizing stress and anxiety. But I guess that's a social problem as well, not just an organizational problem. But you know, organizations, employers are in a prime position to drive this, I guess, positive move towards helping people to be more mentally healthy, because, you know, people spend a third of the time at work, as I say, and by investing in these secondary level interventions and teaching people how they can manage stress better themselves, then, you know, they're not only improving, you know, the increasing benefits for the organization, but they're increasing, you know, the benefits for that person in their life overall. Yeah.
Have some moderate risk. So, how do you come to that conclusion?
On the basis that likelihood is certain, and that without sort of doing a detailed assessment, I guess, on each organisation, I've just assumed that the consequences are moderate, I guess. So, you know, high likelihood, moderate consequences gave me, in my mind, sort of a moderate risk assessment. I don't think that a lot of organisations have actually assessed what the true consequence in terms of cost and productivity is of stress. You know, we measure things like absenteeism, etc., but whether we pulled it all together in terms of determining, well, what is the overall cost to us in terms of lost productivity and overall cost? And some of them might be surprised if they did that analysis and came up with a number, and then, you know, might prompt them to put more resources into these well-being initiatives. Yeah.
Thank you all very much, Tony, and thank you for those questions. Just finally, before we all disappear, I'd like to just remind everybody that now's the time to start considering putting nominations forward for the annual Risk Awards, RiskNZ, that's due in a couple of weeks. So please don't be shy and hide yourself under a bushel or your colleagues, and have a look at the website, look at the methods of nominating your organisation or someone that you know, or even yourself, and please do put yourself forward for a Risk Award for this year. And Lenny, once again, thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.